Thank you so much, Katrina, for this opportunity to be here to share this paper and get your feedback, and especially to Danielle for serving as a discussant on this. Very much looking forward to your comments. So, as Katrina mentioned, this is joint work with my colleague Phil Kiefer, who unfortunately left us at the World Bank and is now at the IDB. It is work that we did in Benin, actually with a lot of help from Leonard and the research agency he founded in Benin, which gathered the data for us. So I'm particularly delighted to share this here with Leonard in the audience. So what we are going to examine is the role of media on shaping citizens' demand and preferences for different public policies. The motivation for this work comes from looking at preferences for private versus public goods to add to this growing body of evidence that voters respond to information, even in developing country contexts where clientelism is rampant in political systems. In a recent policy research report of the World Bank, we reviewed this growing literature on the role of information in shaping political behavior. And as many of you might know, the EGAP Research Network has been doing a meta study or loosely coordinating a group of studies and adding to this evidence on how information shapes accountability and voter behavior in poor countries. But there are two outstanding questions in this research program that we seek to address. One, whether these information-induced shifts in vote shares, which has been pretty well documented now, reflects greater support for candidates who provide public rather than private goods. So the paper that comes closest to what we are trying to do and from which we've learned a great deal is one that Leonard did with Thomas Fujiwara, where they experiment with public deliberation over a more public goods platform, and experimental candidates that they worked with in Benin adopt this experimental platform that is more public goods oriented, and they indeed find a very interesting pattern of effects when candidates adopt these more public goods campaign platforms. But their inferences for whether these platforms indeed shift citizen demand for broad public goods towards broad public goods are more indirect, and we are hoping to provide more direct measures and evidence on this. And also we move beyond experimental in the field deliberate information campaigns to study the impact of naturally occurring media markets in providing information. The second and related open question is whether overall the availability of information in these information markets promotes broad public interest politics, or is it merely one additional factor which shapes the nature of redistributive politics? So for example, Phil has a paper with Ceci Cruz and Julian Labonne, where they in fact find that providing greater information to voters in the Philippines is associated with candidates increasing vote buying activities in the run-up to the elections. Kate Casey's work in Sierra Leone, where she finds very encouragingly that political debates among candidates reduces ethnic-based voting, cannot really rule out that this information may have led the candidates who participated in these debates to provide greater targeted benefits rather than pay attention to broader public goods. And while we've been doing this Benin project for a while now, Phil and I reviewed the available literature. That's our 2014 JDE paper. And we generally concluded that while there's quite a bit of evidence that more informed voters are able to extract greater private benefits from governments, there's really not a whole lot of evidence on whether more informed voters receive more relatively broader public goods. So for example, the pioneering work of Tim Besley and Robin Burgess showed that greater newspaper circulation in certain parts of India allowed those voters who access greater newspapers to receive greater welfare transfers, food security, and relief during natural disasters from the government. But that leaves open the question of, well, what about need? Why should more informed voters get these more targeted benefits? Shouldn't benefits of this kind be targeted solely on the basis of need? In work that I did with the Poverty Action Lab, Abhijit Banerjee and others, in information campaigns to mobilize communities around education in India, we found really no effect of that information campaign on village political incentives to improve the quality of the public education service delivery. In contrast, we found lots of private action in the villages to directly engage youth in the village, directly engaged in improving education, but nothing on public sector governance. And that was echoed in this paper that I just mentioned that Phil and I did with this data in Benin, where we found that greater access to radio improved literacy outcomes among children, but driven purely by greater private investments of households in the education of their children, not by any impact on public sector governance that we could discern. So the second part of the motivation of this work comes from the literature on the particular role of mass media, separate from these experimental information campaigns. So much of this, the research on the role of mass media is dominated by questions of government accountability, such as whether media reduces corruption. The Besley and Burgess paper is about targeting benefits, but there's also cross-country work that Tim Besley has been involved in and others have done, which show that greater freedom of media is associated with lower corruption indicators. And Fred Finan and Claudio Ferraz have a more micro paper in Brazil where they find that in places, in municipalities with radio, measured incidence of corruption in municipal governments is lower. And then, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, there is also a large literature, more qualitative literature on how media is used to induce behavioral change of the private kind towards attitudes towards health and education. And Phil and I provide some of the first evidence on how media, sort of rigorous empirical evidence testing this role of media, of apolitical public interest media that provide these behavior change messages, and we show that it indeed influences private household demand for the health and education of their children. So these are two papers, one on education and the other on household demand and willingness to pay to acquire bed nets to protect their children and their families from malaria. So the question that we ask in this paper, extending our previous work, is does this apolitical public interest media also influence citizens' public demand for health and education services provided by the government? So our contribution is threefold. First and foremost, we examine the role, we test the impact of this apolitical media, apolitical public interest media, and we find very robust, significant evidence that it indeed shifts citizen demand towards more public goods. Second, and more conceptually, we make a case for the value of separating the analysis of the demand side of political markets from the supply side. So most of the work on information's effects has looked at the equilibrium of the supply and demand, on vote shares in equilibrium of different political parties. But looking only at impact on equilibrium vote shares does not allow us to distinguish the potential impact of media on citizens' political behavior, regardless of how the political supply side responds, how candidates respond. So think back again to the paper I mentioned in the Philippines that Phil, Ceci, and Julian did, where in equilibrium what they find is greater vote buying by the supply side, by the political candidates. But that information may have shifted voter behavior in desirable directions that was not possible to discern in that study, but we do here. And indeed, we document a divergence between media's effect on citizens' demand versus political response. And we discuss in the paper how this suggests very fertile opportunities, pathways for future work to examine media's role separately, and based on that understanding, to target policy initiatives towards supporting media or information campaigns in more well thought out ways. And third, our work identifies the effect of a particular type of media market, which consists of multiple fragmented radio outlets, all of which carry relatively uniform programming content of the public interest kind, of the value of health and education, which is sponsored by donors and government ministries. And we thereby complement a growing literature on how the structure of media markets matter for political outcomes. So I'm in particular thinking about the work that Felipe Campante and others have been doing in a completely different context, in the context of the US, where they examine how opposite conditions of media markets, where audiences are segmented into different media outlets, can be one factor accounting for increasing political polarization in contexts like the US. So we generally contribute to that literature on the role of different structures of media markets. So let me now just jump into the particular context we are studying here. We are taking advantage of the existence of this of a very interesting public interest media market, which is prevalent in most of the African continent. And this is distinguished from previous research, which has examined the impact of newspaper circulation and access to national or commercial TV and radio stations. And although there's been a lot of more qualitative study on the role of this public media in Africa, namely community radio, there's been no prior econometric evidence that we are aware of on the impact of this public interest pro-poor community radio in Africa. These are radio stations that are owned and managed by local community organizations, and they are, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, that receive targeted support from various donors to provide public interest programming. And programming on the importance of health and education is a really prominent part of the programs carried on these radio stations. The Rollback Malaria program sponsors a large number of content on the importance of adopting anti-malaria bed nets and other ways of health promotion. USAID shared with us detailed plans of how they promote content on the importance of education and parents paying attention to their children's education. So our contribution then is to examine the impact of this type of media, which has been specifically tasked with reaching and influencing the poor. We also contribute a novel identification strategy. Past research has relied on in identifying the effect of single national-wide radio or television stations by relying on geologic features that interrupt the broadcast of these stations to some locations and not in others, and sort of arguing why those geologic features are exogenous and satisfy the exclusion restriction. And we argue that our contribution is more likely to address the problems of endogeneity and the exclusion restriction, because we exploit a natural experiment in radio markets in northern Benin, where there are multiple small broadcasters rather than a single broadcasters, for whose possible endogenous location we can control for through commune fixed effects, and then we identify the effect of access to these radio stations by the accident of where signals from multiple radio stations end their reach. So I actually had a whole slide on this. So again, this is an old-fashioned natural experiment study which relies on the history of the establishment of community radio in Benin. The nature of this fragmented radio market allows us to take advantage of substantial within-commune variation across villages in access to multiple radio stations. And we are quite confident that this village-level access to multiple radio stations is driven by conditions exogenous to the village. It's largely driven by where these multiple radio signals from low-powered dispersed stations happen to end their reach. And taking advantage of this radio market, we further tailored our sampling strategy to pick 210 villages in this market, matching them on observable geographic characteristics, namely distance from major roads and from radio towers. So this is our study area in northern Benin. And why northern Benin? Because it fulfills the natural experiment criteria I just described in the previous slide. The southern part of Benin is flooded with radio signals, and it was very hard to find sufficient within commune variation across villages. So here's one department that's colored in the map in the box up on the left-hand side. And so you can see pictorially what we are talking about when we say where multiple signals happen to end their reach. The labeled locations are villages, and so we use these maps to pick villages which looked like they were located very close to each other, but might exhibit post-sampling, post-data collection, variation in how many circles, the circles capture the radio signal propagation, how many circles they happen to fall within, that is how many radio signals they can access. This is another department in our sample, and again you can see there's a lot of variation going on with where radio station signals end their reach, and if we pick our village sample purposively to match them on other types of characteristics, it's only ex post that we would hope to see some variation driven by this accident or where these circles, how many circles they fall within. So after we picked that sample, we did of 210 villages, we did this survey in March of 2009 of 4,200 households picked from these villages in 32 of these northern communes of Benin. The village survey included a detailed module on access to signals from different radio stations, and the household survey, in addition to including information on health and education behavior, which we used for our other two papers, included a module with hypothetical vignettes that pose a direct trade-off between spending on private benefits of a government job, which I'll come to when we discuss the vignettes in detail, which are explicitly described in the vignette as being targeted to a few people and comes at the expense of health and education for all. Oh gosh, okay. All right, so this is, I just want to emphasize from here that our measure of radio access does not come from asking the households which radio they listen to. That would be, of course, subject to lots of different problems. It's relying on our enumerators who were equipped with transistors, turning their transistors on and recording which radio stations they were able to access. This is just some summary data, just describing what I've been saying in words. There are 21 community radio stations serving this area, and each of this have quite small signal strength. That's why we get this accident of how many radio stations happen to end their reach around villages. These community radio are quite distinct from other types of radios in this area in that they carry significantly larger numbers of health and education programs. This is a regression just showing that community radio carries more public interest programming, specifically focusing on the value of health and education. We measure citizen demand through this vignette where we rely on available literature which has documented how patronage jobs are a salient currency of clientelism, and we contrast it against the provision of broadly delivered health and education for the benefit of all children in a commune. And we do this using the device of a fixed budget constraint, which a hypothetical candidate can only use to provide jobs for a few versus health for all in some vignettes, and in others which we randomized across households versus education for all. So these are the summary statistics. 59%, as many as 59% of the respondents report voting for jobs for some rather than education for all. Little bit less, 49% reported voting for jobs for some rather than health for all. And those that said they would pick the jobs candidate, also tend to respond in follow-on questions that they think this is generally the right policy for the community. So then we test whether this response of supporting the jobs candidate is influenced by whether the citizen respondent lives in a village with greater access to community radio. And here are the results. The results for health are particularly robust. So when jobs are contrasted against health for all, then citizens living in villages with greater community radio access are significantly less likely to support the jobs candidate. For education, the results are significant only when the sample is confined to households with children, with school-age children. We checked the robustness of this result to many different robustness tests. And then we probed some additional mechanisms which might account for these results, and two of them are particularly important. One, are our results driven by just reducing taste for patronage or clientelism, or is it indeed this channel that we think is that we have other evidence on that radio does affect citizen private demand for health and education? And perhaps even more importantly, is all of this just picking up some social desirability bias in how people are responding to vignette questions when they are sort of flooded with messages of certain kinds from Facebook. And in order to rule out these two alternate interpretations, we rely on a third vignette that we included, which was designed to capture citizens' attitudes to gift giving at the time of elections, which is a euphemism for vote buying. So here's our vignette for presenting citizens with two candidates, one of whom gives gifts and the other does not. And we find that 44% would report voting for the gifts-giving candidate. And of these, 65% respond that they think gifts-giving candidates are more likely to be corrupt. 43% say they may also be more likely to deliver on service delivery promises. But as many as 35% respond that they would vote for the gift-giving candidate, even though they believe the candidate is more likely to be corrupt and no more likely to deliver service promises. So for various reasons, we expect this gift-giving responses to this gift-giving vignette to really capture any action happening with social desirability bias or with attitudes to clientelism more broadly. We find no significant effect of radio access, no matter how we cut the sample, on responses to gift giving. And so this is our conclusion. We think we are providing novel evidence on the demand side of politics. We are contributing a new measure of citizen demand, which allows us to contrast citizen demand for public versus private goods with an explicit trade-off. It's new evidence of media's effects on this measure of citizen demand. And we conclude with highlighting the many different ways in which this kind of research can be taken forward, not only for research, but also for policy impact on using untapped potential of media markets to promote more public interest politics. Thank you.